Hello, I am Logons, and this is my submission for Cursed Conlang Circus 4, as well as my first submission for one of these in general, and my first video on this channel regarding conlanging. I do have to give a disclaimer, as while I have been conlanging for a couple of years, I still consider myself an amateur, and there will probably be some dumb mistakes in my terminology or graphs. Just bear with me if you can. Anyways, my submission is the language of Suotah, as a bastardized version of the native term. Suotah. As you can tell from the sound of the name alone, the language is not spoken by humans, or at least not ordinary ones. More on that now. The Suotah are an elusive species of warped, hominid-like flying animals. It is hard to classify them because they are in essence close enough to being human, albeit a different species either via separation in the past or mutation in the present, all because they inhabit the upper layers of the Venusian atmosphere. Now, before you get on your astronaut suit and board a space taxi to go meet your strange distant cousins, don't get your hopes up, because as far as we know, they live in some other dimension, one that we haven't found yet, as the only attestation we have of the Suotah are those that escaped into other dimensions and presumably told their tales, then either went into hiding or left for the dimension once again. However, from what they tell us, we know plenty enough to at least pin down what a Suotah is, and how their version of Venus compares to ours. It seems to be very much identical with ours, save for less than 100 spires of unknown origin or nature. Around these spires are obviously the Suotah, but also a handful of more terrestrial-like species like plants, bugs, and a highly adapted form of rodent, all of which, including the Suotah, evolved to somehow breathe in a high Venusian atmosphere. It is these spires that allow the Suotah to perch and rest, and of course contributes to forming societies. Despite their hitchhiking nature mentioned previously, such societies are primitive compared to terrestrial ones, and they have not established any sort of governance beyond family bonds nor writing systems. This does not come as a surprise, however, as the small area they have to work with makes this fault more of an inevitability rather than a sign of lackluster effort. While they do not have writing, they do have a couple of pictograms to indicate hunting spots, directions to other spires, and territorial symbols, which are colloquially understood just the same as any other literate species would understand writing in their language. This of course means that any written examples are either in another script entirely, or written in Latin, meaning either the Suotah had translators to inscribe their text, or at least knew some English or other languages using the Latin alphabet. On to phonology. The Suotah anatomy contributes greatly to the alien quality of the language. You will note their head is long, not as an evolved beak of sorts. The whole length of their head is homologous to our mouth, and there are many features that are completely new too. At the opening of their mouths, you will find 3 or 4, depending on if they lost one during birth, wires stretched across the length of their mouth, which can be made slack to move them out of the way and disable obstruction, or be stretched so that they run over the center of airflow, making them obstruct sounds. Using their highly extended tongue, they can also strum the wires as a phoneme. Besides that, there are 2 places of articulation which remain mostly the same, which is the bilabial and alveolar, though the alveolar is almost too vague to call it such. Moving back in the mouth, there is immediately a difference, as a flap similar in function to the uvula can be found near the middle of the roof of the mouth. This, as already implied, can be used to make sounds that approximate to uvulars. Further behind this flap, there is another, seemingly homologous to the vocal folds and epiglottis. Due to the horizontal nature of the whole airway until this point, separation between the gastric tract and the air tract is accomplished simply by bending their neck ever so slightly, which presses a cartilaginous structure against either the air tract or the gastric tract, respectively. Anyways, this rear flap is not approximate to any usual sound we can make, rather to a trill in the glottal place. For us humans, we can do this in a manner similar to burping. To be more specific with the phonology of Suotah, there are 8 distinct consonant sounds in the language, which are p, t, tw, f, s, and sw. There are 2 more which both involve the wires of the mouth. First is the aforementioned strumming of the wires using the tongue, and the second is a bilabial fricative while the wires are obstructing airflow. These are respectively and f. There are also a few consonant clusters, being pt, tp, and p, which is allophonic with t, but for the purposes of transliteration we will only be using p. On the topic of vowels, it should be noted that there is no voicing in Suotah, as the structures usually responsible for voice are warped to become another flap. So instead, Suotah uses syllabic trills and fricatives, as well as rounding to distinguish 8 vowel-type sounds. These are, in order of unobstructed, uvular, and intral, both unrounded and rounded, are and. The grammar of Suotah is strange, but methodical. I will start with what I refer to as paradigms, though admittedly there is probably a better understood term for what I am describing, so basically, when making a phrase, the word order and rules of affixation and such change depending on what exactly is in that phrase. The changes organize themselves into a sort of hierarchy, where the presence of one element supersedes the presence of another, and because of this, there are also rules for affixation and such that apply only when the part is of the paradigm that has been superseded. It sounds complicated, but Suotah groups together many potential parts of the phrase into 7 paradigms, which are the following in order of always superseded to always supersedes. Actionless, when there is no verb present in the phrase. This paradigm applies to responses to questions like specifications of actors. As such, there are included some ways to indicate the specified part is something other than the subject. Regular, when there is a standard 3 elements only, no dative, no genitive, no locative, or relationals. I'll get into that later. If you really need to mark down a single word order as the standard, then VSO word order used in this paradigm would be it. Do note that neither of the previous two have supersession forms. This is just because all the features found in both of the actionless and regular paradigms are distinguished in all other paradigms as well. Genitive taking, when the phrase has a genitive. Dative taking, when the phrase has a dative. Locative, when the phrase has a locative, and also from here on out, the paradigms refer to groups and have rules to specify within that group. Relational, when the phrase has what I refer to as relationals, which include a lot of things from instrumental case to possessive case. And finally, interpossessive, special paradigm used when 2 already established parts of the phrase possess the other. So once you get out of the way which paradigm to use, there are not a lot of other rules besides those dictated by the paradigm that apply to the noun specifically. One key exception is grammatical number, in which infixation is used to distinguish between singular, dual, paucal, plural, and grand paucal forms. The infixation is always done directly following the first consonant, so a word like dosa would be dosa in the dual, or dosa in the plural. I did partially lie when I said there was nothing else with nouns, because technically there is. All adjectives are by default nominalized, meaning without declension they are just the big, instead of being the adjective big. Like this, adjectives are always affixed to indicate adjectivizing or copulifying, which I'll get to in a second. This same system applies to what we would know as nouns, so you could say something is dog-like the same way you would say something is small. And the number of the adjective does not have to match the noun it applies to, because you are referring to the adjectivified noun's number. If you were to apply a dual adjective to a dual noun, you'd be saying, the 2 things are like 2 other things, instead of, the 2 things are like this. Going back to copulas, the way copulas are formed is done entirely via adjectives, using a parallel set of affixes to adjectifiers, and a slightly different rule, like the number mostly having to match the noun it is applied to. And lastly, before we have to talk about the verbs, the pronouns. The pronoun system in Suotah is relatively straightforward, if anything at all, a bit overspecific in places. Personal pronouns are treated as nouns in affixation and such, and there are 5 persons, 3 ordinary exclusive, first, second, third, and 2 inclusive, the first and second. For demonstratives, they can always be used as articles and alone pronouns. There are demonstratives for whether the referent is close to both the speaker and listener, or whether only one is close to the referent, one for each arrangement, if both are far from the referent, and just a general definitive pronoun. They can also be affixed like nouns, at least if not used as articles. Finally, there are a couple of indefinite pronouns, including the titular indefinite pronoun, a distributive pronoun, and an impersonal pronoun. The latter is notable for only being used as a filler when either an intransitive verb or subjectless verb needs to have something fill the space of an object or subject to distinguish parts of the phrase. Now, time for the dreaded verbs. To start, Suotah has grammatical verb subordination, which means that verbs that are subordinated either temporally or causally have specific forms that they are arranged into. For an example, 2 phrases that happen simultaneously have their verbs fused together in a cluster of affixes and the 2 verbs, which indicate finiteness, voice, aspect, and mood. That last one should worry you, because to even have a single verb with an aerialis mood, you need to use simultaneous subordination, with a placeholder verb instead of the second verb, of course. The structures these hybrid verbs are arranged to are complicated, to say the least, but just know that it is mostly fine if you don't need to subordinate verbs, because even the simultaneous subordination needed to use irrealis moods is shortened by the fact that the placeholder verb does not have aspect or mood. With a single verb, assuming you don't need to use subordination, you mark finiteness, which includes finite along with infinitive, gerund, participle, and agent. Then you mark both aspect and voice at the same time with one affix representing both. That is all you have to do for a single verb, but for irrealis moods that use subordination, you will also need to of course mark for mood, in which case you use an affix that represents a group of irrealis moods, then specify which in the group it is using a particle on the same side of the hybrid verb as the verb that has this mood. The specification particles are numerical, meaning the same particle will specify the same numbered mood on different group lists. Some, however, do differ depending on which group and which numbered mood you are specifying. Coming away from that mess, negation is a much simpler concept in Suotah. There are negation affixes for verbs, nouns, adjectives, and different negations for nouns for singular and non-singular forms. While this is good for negating specific parts, like in denial of a specific object, it wasn't he who hit the rock, if you need to negate a whole phrase, you just negate the subject. For the numerical system, Suotah operates under a base 7 system, mostly due to their unique hand counting where they count multiples of 7 on 3 fingers of one hand, and the 7th place on the remaining fingers. Ordinal numbers are applied to the counted verb as a genitive, while cardinal numbers are themselves nouns with the counted noun applied to the number as a genitive. And finally, for conjunctions, there are just two, a cumulative, what we would know as and an alternative, what we would know as or. These can go in between two same parts of a phrase or in between phrases. To change these contrastive forms, use negation, and which negation you use depends on what you are contrasting, most being obvious, but for entire phrases, the negation is that used for verbs. For the translation text, I tried to make the language fit the text the best I could, as well as replacing most of the metaphors with ones that would be applicable to the Suotah cultural norms. Before hearing the translation, I will take a moment to explain some of these metaphors. Fly into the eternal sky. Suotah that seek immortality or otherwise want a hidden way out simply fly into the distance. No one will go after them if they make it far enough, and they will be said to have just kept flying forever. Fall to Atatak's surface. Atatak, or is a mythological being to the Suotah that represents the uninhabitable and deadly surface of Venus that all matter eventually falls to. Falling to the surface represents expediting your fate, thus making an example out of yourself the cruelty and fragility of life. Like the many days is often used for something like time for the Suotah, as they are keenly aware of their aberrant nature and predict that they have not been there for that long. Tying the clouds. Often for shorter periods of time, intermittent cloud patterns are divinated for approximations of the time, mostly due to the blurry nature of the sun through the Venusian atmosphere, and because Suotah cannot look up that easily to measure the angle of the sun on account of their slouch, to put it lightly, posture. Tying the clouds would not be to stop anything but the divination, because the clouds run in every direction, surface and sky, thus being infinite. Know of the days. This was mostly an attempt to reconcile testament in Suotah, as the term is a religious one and the Suotah do not have much of an organized religion. So when they know of the days, just like how a testament reminds you aggressively of something, to know of the days is to be keenly aware of time and its progression. Now that that's out of the way, let's get on to the translation. While I would like to say something like thank you in the Suotah language, it would be unfitting for their culture. They only take what they can get and don't have much effort left for gratitude. They do, however, have compliments and good wishes, so I'll end it with this. Or, may you fly not towards the surface, but towards the grass. As usual, be sure to check out the other submissions for the Cursed Conlang Circus 4.